Story 1. When I was young, I worked for a large supermarket chain. All my friends were going to Mexico for a week, and my job would not give me the time off. My department was in the very back of a 100,000 square foot building. Store management never ventured back there. So, I had my work friend clock me in and out every day for a week. Nobody noticed, and I somehow got away with it. Laugh out loud. Story 2. The rule was no causing a scene in public. My brother and I were kids at the time. I was 7 and he was 5. We were allowed a rare treat at the restaurant where we were eating dinner. Dessert. We both got the same thing, a chocolate sundae. They assured us repeatedly that there were no nuts in it. My brother was and is severely allergic to nuts. I found a nut in mine and told my brother not to eat any more of his. My parents did not believe me and told me to knock it off. Let him eat. So I started screaming, crying, yelling, and carrying on, and threw my ice cream down on the floor. There were nuts in it. My parents saw. They took my brother's ice cream away quickly to check his, and yes, full of walnuts. They went from being furious with me for throwing the tantrum of a century to shock. I was not making up stories. I was trying to save my brother's life. Story 3. Wanted to spend the holidays with my new girlfriend and her family. I used to work in a restaurant and hadn't taken a single day off during the holidays in the past 10 years. The chef, who was always at home during weekends and holidays himself, said, "No can do, you're young. You shouldn't waste your time at home." So I went to the doctor, explained the situation, and straight up asked if he could write me off for Christmas Eve. He wrote me off for a month. Exactly enough time to celebrate the holidays and find me another job. They are closed now during the holidays due to no one wants to work anymore and wonder why. Story 4. I worked in my school's library in the 11th grade. There was a rule from the state about not being able to get your yearbook and or graduate if you owed library fines or had books out past a certain date, considered lost at that point. I was told this a hard rule, from the guy who moved away before he turned in his books and owed hundreds of dollars, the biggest fine I'd seen, to the guy that was one day late and owed like 15 cents. A pair of twins came in, the Andersons. I remember because The Matrix was kind of a big deal to me at the time, although it had already been out for years, and I always greeted them, "Hello, Mr. Anderson." Anyway, despite being from a low-income family myself, the only reason we had a house was because of the Veterans Association. The students were kind of bougie. We did fundraising assemblies every year, and there would frequently be checks written for over $100 from a good chunk of the students. The Andersons lived in the one apartment complex in our boundaries, and I knew their family was struggling. For whatever reason, they weren't on free/reduced lunch, and I hardly ever saw them eat. My mom worked for school foods for the district somewhere else and took leftovers home despite the rules against it. She never liked good food feeding the garbage, and the food banks wouldn't take it. I was tasked to bring in a chunk of leftovers, say I had got more than I wanted, and after giving them the styrofoam box, a dead giveaway, I would get in line for my own food. Never asked for anything in return, and it was one of the only times I didn't resent the leftovers from her school. So back to my part. The pair had 3-ish books that had been marked return damaged by the library teacher. She was nice and rarely malicious. I checked their account, and they owed something like $23 for both of them. I grabbed the books from the repair cart and did notice some pen marks from a stray pen, a torn cover that was already worn out, and some minor damage. Needless to say, I had seen worse and it was fined less. Some of it was based on the replacement value of the book, but some were discretion. They were both getting ready to graduate but couldn't with fines. They were coming to talk to the teacher to see about an alternative arrangement. They offered to volunteer for the library, be put on a payment plan or whatever because it was now desperate, and they didn't learn until that day that they had fines. Not uncommon for a repair fine to be delayed. Graduation was in 2 days. We never took volunteer work for fines, and rarely did we extend payment plans over a summer and never to graduating seniors. The teacher was out for whatever reason, not uncommon, and I couldn't work within the rules. I had to help them out. I told the pair to circle back after lunch, split period, and I would see what I could do. Luckily, these weren't the only copies of the books we had, so I swapped out the dust jackets, fixed the minor obvious tears, and placed the books back on the shelf with the others in the repair cart. I then erased their fine as paid, she never tallied or did a till anyway, and printed their paperwork to give to the guys that passed out caps and gowns. I made it a point to repair the swapped books myself during that period. I fussed a little over them, uncommon, and told the teacher, "Hey, these are labeled for repair, but I can't find what you wanted to be fixed." Eventually, I was told to reshelve them as it was probably an oversight, and that was that. The Andersons came by after lunch, and I handed them the papers. I was a little obvious when I told them, "Thanks for paying your fines. Here are your receipts," before they could even say anything. But they got the hint, mouthed thank you, left looking a lot lighter, and were able to graduate. I still Facebook stalk them from time to time. One is an instrumentation technician making serious money, and the other co-founded a nonprofit that helps tutor kids, passes out food for families during the holiday gaps, and everyone that goes there can get a free book. Oh, the irony, and I'd 100% do it again. Story 5. Performed the lab test CETO, a faster version that only takes an hour instead of 4 hours. I wasn't supposed to do that because we were almost out of material and it was only for emergencies. When I was informed that the patient does not get a room until the test is done and the patient is currently intubated in the middle of the hallway. Story 6. I was a technical lead at my job, which basically means I was an employee who had put in a few years of service learning the business. We had a big meeting planned. The idea was to do a group training with the client and their team while planning the rollout. The sales manager missed his connecting flight and told me to cancel the meeting or push it to tomorrow. It had taken us 4 months to get this on the calendar. I knew it was going to potentially ruin a deal they just signed a week ago. The ink was still drying. So I ran the meeting without him, and by the time he arrived at the hotel, the client had sent an email stating that they wanted me to be the lead on the account. I didn't know this, and he practically beat down my door asking, "Who the hell do you think you are?" And so on for a solid 45 minutes. The next day, I had a call invite with the company owner and knew it was about me being fired. We got on and went around the room recapping. One last thing to confirm, the client stated you did all this and sold them on the X product line, which they had previously refused. Is that true? Yeah, I believe the product wasn't explained on how it filled a gap for them. They will end up saving money by doing it. Seems a no-brainer. Owner, right? And that's why you've been promoted to a regional sales position. This 5-year deal is now listed under your book of business, and you will take home the 1% signing bonus. Great work. Just don't do that again. This changed my career arc and essentially my life. I don't have a degree, only a high school diploma. Now I work at a Fortune 500 company, which is kind of crazy. Story 7. I filled out an official human resources self-evaluation as if I was a lunatic. I wrote that I shaved half my head on a dare and ate pavement chunks while dressed as a pigeon. I also stole shopping carts to build forts and proposed to all of the customers. I signed my name and handed it in. Human resources didn't respond. I got a full raise that year. Story 8. I was told by my manager at Target to stop this lady who was shoplifting with her kids until security came to help. I politely asked her to please see her receipt and just tried to buy time. She quickly rushed me and started punching me in the face while her 2 little kids were screaming and crying. By instinct, I grabbed her hair and tried to pull her down to the ground with me. Turns out it was a weave, and I completely ripped it off. She quickly ran off after that, leaving her weave there. They found her later and charged her with a misdemeanor for assault and shoplifting. However, I was fired because she made a complaint against me, saying I was racist and purposely embarrassed her in front of her kids by pulling off her weave. Target fired me that following week for engaging with a shoplifter and racial profiling/discrimination, even though it was my manager who told me to stop her. Of course, my manager denied everything and later told me she was sorry, but she needed to keep her job. I was honestly shocked but so upset by that situation that I've never stepped foot into a Target ever again. Story 9. Not sure about extreme, but probably the dumbest. I cussed out a teacher at a strict young ladies boarding school in the late 80s during one of my rebellious streaks. Yeah, bad idea. As for punishment, the school had a cow barn with 12 cows, I believe for an agricultural education course. If you acted up in class, you'd get detention, lines, the paddle, but the highest on the disciplinary ladder was dairy duty. Yes, they actually called it that. You'd be sent to the cow barn at 5:30 p.m., about 30 to 60 minutes after the agricultural students had finished cleaning, and would be made to clean the barn of manure with bare hands. Gloves, shovel, etc., strictly forbidden, and the wheelbarrow stayed outside of each stall. Honestly, I didn't take it as seriously as maybe I should have. I figured, it's 12 cows, and the barn had just been cleaned half an hour ago. How bad could it be? Answer: very, very bad. I did not make that mistake again. Story 10. I was working at the local market a few years ago. While scanning a guy's items, he just approached and whispered, "I have a knife in my pocket. How about you just put the money in that bag too, and we can say our goodbyes?" A rough translation, I tried my best. I stood there frozen and thought of what I should do, then looked at the people behind him. Couldn't risk getting someone else hurt, so I just gave him the money and let him go. So I stood there, scared, calling the manager. Turns out I broke a rule because what I should have done is turn the alarm on and warn everybody. My paycheck was cut for the stolen amount because I decided not to risk lives over a mere $500. Needless to say, I quit on the spot. Story 11. Definitely not that high stakes, but it was funny. A few years ago, I was a broke college student living about 40 minutes from the university. I couldn't afford a dorm, but two of my buddies shared one. I spent all semester squatting in that dorm. All the guys on our wing were cool with it, always letting me in the building. The resident assistant had no idea, just always said I was a guest. I slept on a mat under my friend's bed and used a dresser as my desk. One friend went to study abroad after the first semester, so I signed up to stay in the room. The resident assistant called me by his name because she thought I was the actual tenant the entire time. Story 12. I was stuck in non-moving bumper-to-bumper traffic on a highway entry ramp. It was a terrible thunderstorm, and I realized I had made a horrible mistake not taking the local roads home because I was already committed to the highway, which was extremely backed up. Then the tornado sirens started going off, and I did not want to be a sitting duck in traffic, so I U-turned out of there, going the wrong way on the entry ramp. The drive home on local roads was the scariest moment of my life, but felt less daunting than not moving. It was the first and only time I broke a traffic law, and I don't regret it. Story 13. I went to a semi-boarding high school where about 10% of students boarded, and new dorms were constructed while I was there. We had a big meeting, and the principal said, "No students of the opposite sex in your dorm room. We don't want anyone having sex." A bit paraphrased. One of the students stood up and said, "What about the gay kids? They get to have sex." So for about a month, the rule was no students of the opposite or same sex in your dorm room, with the exception of your roommate. Story 14. One of the most extreme rule-breaking moments I've ever had was during a college road trip. We were driving through a remote part of the country when our old, beat-up car decided to give out. Stranded without cell service and not a soul in sight, we realized we were near a famed but restricted scenic overlook. With no help coming and several hours to kill before the next town, we decided to jump the fence and explore the off-limits area. The view was breathtaking, stretching miles of untouched wilderness. As the sun set, the sky turned into a palette of vibrant colors, and the air was the freshest I had ever breathed. Felt like standing on the edge of the world. Technically, we were trespassing, but in that moment, surrounded by such incredible beauty, the rules seemed trivial. It was an unforgettable experience that taught us sometimes the best memories are made when you color a little outside the lines. Story 15. I was driving home one night after seeing a musical at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. This must have been right before the global positioning system. I lived in the northern suburbs. I decided to take Broad Street home because I knew where I would end up if I went this way. There was barely any traffic. I reached a bad section of the city. I was seeing lots of unsavory people hanging out on the street corners, and this was during a period of unusually high gang violence. I decided I was not going to be stopping for any red lights if there was no opposing traffic. There is not a police officer in the city who would have given me a ticket for that. Story 16. My stepdad was having a feud with the neighbors over trees, and it got to the point where it affected his health. Out of love for him, I wrote anonymous letters to the neighbors, pretty much telling them to cool it and make peace. The fact that the letters were anonymous had them concerned that someone was threatening them, although that was not my intent. A lawyer looked at a copy of the letter and said that nothing about it was threatening, but told me not to do it again, nor to reveal that I did it. The neighbors did not know who wrote the letter.